The city of Porto was built along the hillsides overlooking the mouth of the Douro River. Selected as the best European destination for 3 years, what has made the city stand out so much among so many other European cities? Located on the two sides of the Eurasia continent, how can Chinese and Portuguese better connect with each other? Earlier, I was in the Portuguese city of Porto and I met the city's mayor, Rui Moreira. I started by asking him what makes Porto so special that it has been selected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and 3 times Europe's best tourist destination.
Porto is a comfortable and interesting city. It's not too big. By Chinese standards, it's a very small city. It has an heritage. It's a very young city in terms of its population because we have a big university. And this combination of heritage and of a modern living style, I think, makes Porto a unique city. Also the fact that it's one of the safest cities in Europe. Actually, Portugal is the 3rd safest country in the world, and Porto is the safest city in Portugal. So I think for tourists who these days are very concerned about their safety, and safety in terms of everything, of climate changes and everything else, I think it makes Porto very attractive. And then, of course, the lifestyle. I think people enjoy coming here, enjoying our wines, our gastronomy, our history, but then looking at everything which is modern and which is happening with our theaters, with our collections, with our art. And I think that's what makes this sort of combination of a city which was basically a hidden treasure until a few years ago, because we kept the city closed for too long.
Well, I mentioned 3 times Europe's best
Yes.
tourist destination, and all of these 3 times happened in the past, let's say, 6-7 years.
Yes.
So indeed, it was a hidden treasure that newly discovered. What did it mean for you as the mayor of the city? You came into this position in 2013, October, and then you were re-elected for the 2nd term last year. What did it mean to you to help the world discover the hidden beauties of Porto?
Well, we thought basically when we came, when I decided to run for mayor, that this treasure had to be shown for the benefit of its own citizens. A lot of cities want to stay close because they think that bringing newcomers, foreigners, affects the traditions. It's not true as long as you have a strong cultural background. So you have to work on the local culture to guarantee that it's the foundation of the city and of the society, and then you should not be afraid to open up. And I think we did open up, and what we did first of all was to build a brand for the city. The city did not have a brand. We were known by different names. O Porto by the British, Porto by ourselves, and our wine was called Port. So imagine having 3 names. It made no sense.
What did you do?
So basically we worked on the brand of Porto Dot, which these days won a lot of prizes. We were inspired a little bit in things like I Love New York from years ago, but we decided to keep only one name, to concentrate on one image. And this image and this Porto Dot, the dot is actually the combination of everything we have, which sort of expands into the culture, into the gastronomy, into the lifestyle, into the traditions as well, because the Porto citizens are very proud of their traditions. So we had to be sure that on opening the city, we at the same time were inspired to keep the traditions. And that's a difficult combination, actually.
What does your interaction with China mean for all of the things you try to achieve here?
Well, as you know, the relationship between Portugal and China is a fantastic history of a fantastic relationship where we were always friends. We were always on the good side. We exchanged a lot of cultural values. And when I came in, I found out that we had a relationship, namely with Shanghai, which was basically dormant. It had not been developed. Also with Macau, for reasons that everyone understands, because Macau was a Portuguese administered territory for a while. And then we also looked at the new cities. We looked at Shenzhen as a target. And we started exchanging visits. We started visiting Shanghai, visiting Beijing as well, as you know, where we met, visiting Macau, and also promoting trade, promoting values, promoting culture. And
what has come out of those exchanges? Any concrete results?
Well, you can see some concrete reasons. It's not really the job of the mayor of a city, of course, to promote individual products. But the fact is, when we look now at the trade figures between the north of Portugal and China, in some things like, for instance, beer, which is something which made little sense a few years ago. Now we have Superboc. I know that
beer, yeah.
Beer.
Sure.
The wine, Portuguese wine. Last time I was in Beijing, I arrived at the hotel, I looked for a bottle of wine. There was Portuguese wine there from the Porto district. Something which we could not find years ago. On the textile, we find that whereas we buy a lot of textiles from China, we are also able to export garments and textiles. And then, of course, the cultural aspect, which is so important. And also on the tourism side, because the fact that Porto is today known in China, it wasn't a few years ago, has enabled a lot of Chinese to find that they want to discover Porto, they want to discover our river, they want to discover our vineyards, they want to and that's something which is also very interesting, because we have a very strong Chinese community in Porto and around Porto. One of the most, we are at the moment protecting what we call heritage shops and restaurants. One of the first to be recognized was a Chinese restaurant which has existed in the city for 40 years.
Really?
It is considered as a heritage of the city. Imagine, it's also almost a museum shop, which is a Chinese restaurant.
Then.
You have to go there. It's very good.
It's
extremely good. So it is also because of the Chinese community, which is so active in the region of Porto and the north, that we really want to foster this relationship, because we know for them they have like two nationalities. They are still Chinese, but they want to be citizens of Porto. And their kids are in school, and for their kids, the relationship we are building with China makes them, of course, very proud, because they have this double feeling of pertaining.
Sure. Well, in terms of Chinese investment, what has been the areas that Chinese investors are most looking at, and what has been the impact of their investment here in Porto?
Well, as you know, when we started with the project of privatizations, recent projects of privatization some years ago, the Chinese investors have bought some of the biggest companies in Portugal. And this is something the Portuguese appreciate very much, because it was at the time when the rest of the world was suspecting that Portugal was not viable. When you decided to buy the electrical company EDP, which is so strong in Porto, it was for us, that company started in Porto, was founded in Porto. It was very important. The insurance company like Fidelidade, who is one of the main stakeholders of the city in terms of property, with REN. But also now, looking at the business in food, there's a lot of Chinese investors in things like canning industries, food industries. Also on textiles and garments, there are a lot of people showing interest. So there is a lot of, and the Portuguese economy is very open, as you know, and we very much appreciate that Chinese economy is today also very open when we compare it with the United States, which is closing its borders. We see very favorably how China is opening its borders. So I think there is a lot of potential.
Any measures to further welcome or facilitate Chinese investment here in Porto, in Portugal, for your side, or also welcoming Chinese tourists? If you want to attract them, you have to make them feel comfortable, the facilities, the signs, I don't know, the language, for instance, what is being done there to make it a sustainable business?
To develop more Chinese tourism in Porto, we need basically direct flights. This has been on our agenda, on the agenda of the Portuguese Prime Minister, also on the agenda of the Chinese ambassador in Lisbon, who I visited several times. And this was one of the key issues when I last visited China. Whereas Lisbon has had, and it has stopped recently, flights between Beijing and Lisbon. We would like very much to have flights between Shanghai and Porto. We have local people interested in that venture. That is the key, because a lot of Chinese who want to come to Porto, they do not want to fly via intermediate airports, which are not comfortable. Also for me, who I travel very often to China, I would travel more often if I could have direct flights. So that's the main target. Until the target is achieved, there is not much more we can do. But what we see, especially on the river, especially the people who start in Porto and go up the river and down the river and want to see the vineyards. More and more Chinese are coming, and they are very curious about it. Some of them are interested in buying properties, small properties in the city, and we are very open to that.
Porto, you mentioned the wine, the port wine, which is also very famous here. The Chinese love good wine. They are also in a search of quality food and beverage from around the world. So what is being done to make the story of Port more accessible, more enjoyable to the Chinese consumers?
What I have seen, and I saw it almost by coincidence, one of the last times I was in Macau, I was in one of the hotels, and there was a presentation of a Portuguese wine. And I decided to look into it, to see how they were organizing it. And suddenly I saw a lot of Portuguese exporters, a couple of Portuguese exporters, and they were really inviting chefs of very renowned restaurants in China, not only in Macau, and also people who had small shops in China, and they were trying to tell them what is Port, the story of Port, because I think more and more for the Chinese consumer they do not want only a good product, but they want the history associated to that product. The story. Yeah. That's a very specific angle that the Chinese consumer looks, is the history behind. And I think that's being done extremely in a very efficient way. Of course, Port has a small production. And one of the things that Port misses when it is in China is we have to understand it's not like selling Campari, which is produced industrially. Port is produced, is handmade, is like a treasure, is like a jewel. And so we have to look at specific targets. We can't look at the broad market because we just don't have enough production.
Yeah. Finally, looking as a commentator, looking at the exchanges China is having with its partners around the world, what would you say is the most important thing that we need to keep in mind in terms of making people understand each other better, breaking down barriers?
What we have to bear in mind is open commercial exchanges are will be the main, I think the main tool to keep the world safe. If we decide to start closing our borders, if we start into trade wars, normally we will end up with a problem. The other thing we have to do is to look at the planet and to look at some continents which are having a lot of problems, and I know exactly how much China has been investing in Africa. That's a very good example for the Europeans. When you look at the migration problems we are facing in Europe, it is happening because we have not been able to create jobs there, to create capacities there. So I think the common goal for Europe and China would be to capacitate these populations in countries like the Middle East, like Africa, where if we give them the chance, if we give them the tools, they will be happier. We will have a less dangerous world. We will have a more open world. And I think the Chinese are doing a fantastic job in that respect.
Thank you very much,
My
Mr.
pleasure.
Rui Moreira, the Mayor of the City of Porto.